December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Private First Class John McKinley of the 99th Infantry Division huddled in his foxhole, trying to sleep through another freezing night on what everyone called the Ghost Front. The Ardennes sector was where divisions went to rest, where green troops learned the ropes, where nothing ever happened. The Germans were finished. Everyone knew it. The war would be over by Christmas. Then the horizon exploded. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The barrage was so intense that soldiers 20 miles away felt the ground shake. McKinley scrambled from his foxhole into a world transformed into hell. Trees disintegrated into splinters. Foxholes collapsed, burying men alive. The frozen ground erupted in geysers of dirt and snow and blood. "They're supposed to be beaten," someone screamed over the thunder of shells. "They're supposed to be out of fuel, out of tanks. How is this happening?" What Private McKinley couldn't know, what none of the 80,000 American soldiers in the Ardennes could comprehend, was that Adolf Hitler had scraped together every last reserve of the German military for one desperate gamble. A massive counteroffensive designed to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. Hitler had committed 410,000 men, 1,400 tanks, and 4,000 artillery pieces to an attack the Allies thought was impossible. The Germans called it Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge, and for 6 weeks in the winter of 1944, it would become the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fought in World War II. This is the story of how Hitler's last gamble nearly succeeded, how American soldiers, outnumbered and surrounded, held impossible positions against overwhelming odds, and how a generation of citizen soldiers proved that courage, improvisation, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit could defeat the most carefully planned military operation of the war. By December 1944, Nazi Germany was dying. The Red Army was crushing eastward toward Berlin. British and American forces had liberated France and were pressing toward the Rhine. German cities were being reduced to rubble by round-the-clock bombing. The war, everyone agreed, would be over in months, if not weeks. But Adolf Hitler, isolated in his bunker, refused to accept reality. He studied maps showing the Ardennes Forest, the same route German forces had used to stunning effect in 1940. The Allies had left it weakly defended, considering it impassable for large armored formations. Hitler saw opportunity. "We will strike through the Ardennes," Hitler told his stunned generals in October 1944. "We will drive to Antwerp, split the British from the Americans, encircle 4 Allied armies, and force them to negotiate. It will be 1940 all over again." His generals thought he was insane. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, called the plan absolutely impossible, given Germany's fuel and equipment shortages. But Hitler was beyond listening. He ordered the attack prepared in absolute secrecy, stripping the Eastern Front of resources, pulling together new divisions from training depots, and assembling the last operational reserve of German armor. The Germans achieved complete surprise. American intelligence, overconfident after months of German retreat, ignored warning signs. The Allies believed Germany lacked the fuel for a major offensive. They were wrong. Hitler had been hoarding fuel reserves for months specifically for this attack. When the barrage began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, American units across the Ardennes were caught completely off guard. Many soldiers were eating breakfast. Some were sleeping. None were prepared for what hit them. The first wave consisted of elite German units, SS, Panzer divisions, paratrooper regiments, and the best remaining Wehrmacht infantry formations. They struck 8 American divisions spread thinly across the front, many of them either green troops seeing their first combat or exhausted veterans sent to the quiet sector to rest. Lieutenant Lyle Buck commanded an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of just 18 men at Lanzerath, Belgium, directly in the path of the 1st SS Panzer Division. As dawn broke through the fog, Buck's men watched in horror as an entire German division emerged from the forest, thousands of infantry supported by armor advancing toward their isolated position. Buck radioed for permission to withdraw. His battalion commander, certain the report was exaggerated, ordered him to hold. 18 American soldiers against a division. It should have been a massacre. Instead, Buck's platoon fought one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the war. From carefully prepared positions, they poured rifle and machine gun fire into the advancing Germans with such precision that the enemy believed they faced a reinforced company. For 6 hours, 18 men stopped a division, killing or wounding over 400 German soldiers. They held until they ran out of ammunition. Even then they held, throwing rocks and using captured German weapons. When they were finally overrun in the afternoon, the German commander was so impressed he shook Buck's hand before taking him prisoner. The delay caused by Buck's platoon disrupted the entire German timetable on that sector of the front, but Buck's heroic stand was the exception. Across the Ardennes, American units were being overwhelmed. The 106th Infantry Division, which had been in combat for less than a week, was cut off and surrounded. 2 entire regiments, over 7,000 men, would be forced to surrender on December 19th, the largest mass surrender of American forces in Europe during the war. German panzer columns raced westward, exploiting gaps in American lines. The weather was perfect for the attack. Thick fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft, neutralizing America's air superiority. German tanks rolled through villages where American soldiers were still eating breakfast, creating chaos and panic. The key to the German plan was speed. They needed to capture fuel depots and supply dumps to sustain the offensive. Hitler had given them enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, but no farther. After that, they would have to survive on captured American gasoline. On December 17th, a German SS battle group commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper achieved a breakthrough. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, combat team, consisted of the best tanks Germany still had, including 70-ton King Tigers armed with 88mm guns that could destroy any American tank at incredible ranges. His orders were simple: drive to the Meuse River as fast as possible. Don't stop for anything. Peiper's column raced westward, crushing American units that tried to block the roads. At Malmedy, frustrated by delays and running behind schedule, Peiper's SS troops committed one of the war's most infamous atrocities. They herded 84 captured American prisoners into a field and machine-gunned them in cold blood. News of the Malmedy massacre spread through American units like wildfire. The rage it generated stiffened American resistance. Soldiers who might have considered surrendering when surrounded now fought to the death. The massacre, intended to terrorize, instead hardened American resolve. But Piper's rapid advance was causing panic at Allied headquarters. By December 18th, German spearheads had penetrated 20 miles into American lines. The bulge they created in the Allied front threatened to become a breakthrough. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces from his headquarters in France, rushed reinforcements toward the Ardennes, stripping other sectors to plug the gap. The critical battle developed around the town of Bastogne, a crucial road junction where 7 highways converged. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. The Germans needed it. The Americans knew they couldn't let it fall. The 101st Airborne Division, pulled from rest areas and rushed to Bastogne by truck, arrived just hours before German forces surrounded the town. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander, had barely 18,000 men, paratroopers, engineers, and stragglers from destroyed units, to defend against 3 German divisions totaling over 45,000 men supported by heavy armor. The siege of Bastogne would become legendary. German forces surrounded the town on December 20th, cutting all roads. McAuliffe's men were low on ammunition, had almost no artillery shells, lacked medical supplies, and faced temperatures below freezing without adequate winter clothing. The airborne troops, accustomed to being lightly equipped, were particularly vulnerable to the brutal cold. On December 22nd, German commanders sent surrender terms to McAuliffe under a flag of truce. The message was formal and emphasized the hopelessness of the American position. The fortune of war is changing. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. McAuliffe's one-word reply became one of the most famous responses in military history: nuts. When the German officers receiving the response looked confused, the American officer delivering it explained, "It means go to hell." When the German officers receiving the response looked confused, the American officer delivering it explained, "It means go to hell." The defense of Bastogne was desperate and improvised. Paratroopers used captured German weapons when their ammunition ran out. Medics performed surgery in freezing cellars without proper supplies. Artillery crews fired their few remaining shells with pinpoint precision, making every round count. Tank destroyers hunted German armor through the streets, fighting at point-blank range. The German attacks came in waves. Panzer divisions tried to smash through the American perimeter with overwhelming force. Each attack was thrown back by American defenders who knew that if Bastogne fell, the German offensive might succeed. Meanwhile, north of Bastogne, Piper's Kampfgruppe was running into unexpected resistance. American engineers blew bridges in front of his advance. Small groups of American soldiers ambushed his columns, forcing delays. Most critically, Piper couldn't find the fuel dumps his maps indicated should be in his path. American forces, despite being caught by surprise, had managed to evacuate or destroy most forward fuel supplies. By December 23rd, Piper's tanks were literally running dry. His spearhead, which had penetrated deepest into American lines, was stranded near Stoumont without fuel. American forces surrounded his position. Rather than surrender, Piper abandoned his vehicles and led his men on foot back to German lines through freezing forests, leaving behind over 100 tanks and vehicles, the most powerful striking force of the German offensive, immobilized for lack of gasoline. The weather broke on December 23rd, clear skies allowed Allied aircraft to fly for the first time since the offensive began. American and British fighters and bombers swarmed over the Ardennes, attacking German columns trapped on narrow roads. The Luftwaffe, making its last major appearance of the war, was swept from the sky. Allied air superiority, neutralized by weather for a week, reasserted itself with devastating effect. At Bastogne, C-47 transport planes began dropping supplies to the encircled garrison. Parachutes filled the sky, bringing ammunition, medical supplies, and food to McAuliffe's battered defenders. German anti-aircraft fire shot down several transports, but the supply drops continued. The besieged paratroopers knew they just had to hold a little longer. Relief was coming. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army south of the Ardennes, achieved what military experts considered impossible. In less than 48 hours, he disengaged 6 divisions from active combat, turned them 90 degrees north, and sent them racing toward Bastogne through a blizzard. It was the most rapid, large-scale redeployment in military history. On December 26, lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed through German encirclement and linked up with the 101st Airborne. The siege of Bastogne was broken. McAuliffe's defenders had held for 6 days against overwhelming odds, buying time for Allied reinforcements to arrive and disrupting German timetables beyond repair. But the battle wasn't over. Hitler, refusing to accept that his offensive had failed, ordered continued attacks. German units, now critically short of fuel and ammunition, kept fighting. The bulge continued to expand, though more slowly, as American reinforcements poured into the Ardennes from all directions. The weather turned worse. Temperatures dropped to record lows. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite and exposure. American casualties from cold injuries rivaled combat casualties in some units. Medical personnel struggled to treat wounded in freezing conditions. Plasma froze before it could be administered. Morphine syrettes had to be kept in medics' mouths to prevent freezing. The fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters combat in forests and villages. Visibility in the dense woods was measured in yards. Soldiers fought house to house, room to room, often unable to see their enemies until they were at point-blank range. German troops, many of them teenaged conscripts with minimal training, fought with desperate courage. American GIs, many of them also green troops experiencing combat for the first time, learned on the job or died. Technical Sergeant Vernon McGarity of the 735th Tank Battalion found his unit surrounded near Krinkelt on December 17th. For 3 days, McGarity and a handful of soldiers held a vital road junction against repeated German attacks. Armed only with a rifle and whatever weapons he could scavenge from casualties, McGarity personally stopped multiple German assaults, at one point charging a German machine gun position single-handedly. He would receive the Medal of Honor for actions that typified the stubborn courage of American soldiers throughout the battle. By early January 1945, the German offensive had stalled completely. Hitler's master plan had failed. The Germans hadn't reached the Meuse River, let alone Antwerp. They hadn't split the Allied armies. They hadn't captured significant fuel supplies. Instead, they had expended their last strategic reserve in a failed gamble. American forces, having absorbed the initial shock, now counterattacked. The bulge began to shrink. German units, out of fuel and ammunition, withdrew or were destroyed. Panzer divisions that had begun the offensive with hundreds of tanks limped back to Germany with dozens. Infantry divisions were shells of their former strength. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when American forces eliminated the last German penetrations. The cost was staggering. Over 19,000 Americans killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured, more than 89,000 total casualties, making it the bloodiest battle in American military history. German losses exceeded 100,000 men, along with 800 tanks, thousands of vehicles, and critically, the fuel and ammunition reserves Germany needed to defend against the coming Allied and Soviet offensives. Hitler's gamble had not just failed. It had guaranteed Germany's defeat. The forces squandered in the Ardennes could have been used to defend the Rhine, to slow the Soviet advance, to prolong the war. Instead, they were destroyed in a failed offensive that achieved nothing but death. The human stories from the Bulge revealed the character of American soldiers under extreme stress. At Rocherath-Krinkelt, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions fought a desperate 6-day delaying action that allowed other units to establish defensive lines. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, they held their positions until ordered to withdraw, losing over 5,000 men, but buying time that proved invaluable. At Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery crews fought one of the most successful defensive artillery battles in U.S. military history, breaking repeated German attacks with devastating barrages that turned snow-covered fields into killing grounds. At St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division and remnants of the shattered 106th Infantry Division held a critical road junction for 6 days, preventing German exploitation of their breakthrough until finally withdrawing on December 23rd after being completely surrounded. Individual acts of heroism were so common they became routine. Medics treated wounded under fire, tank crews fought until their vehicles were destroyed, then fought on foot. Engineers blew bridges with enemy tanks approaching. Supply clerks, cooks, and truck drivers picked up rifles and joined the fighting when their positions were overrun. Private First Class Richard Cowan, a cook with the 2nd Infantry Division, grabbed a rifle when his unit was attacked and single-handedly held off German infantry, killing over 20 enemy soldiers before being killed himself. He posthumously received the Medal of Honor. His story was repeated hundreds of times across the Ardennes, ordinary soldiers performing extraordinary acts because their buddies needed them. The African-American soldiers of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 106th Infantry Division, fought until they were overrun. Then many were murdered by SS troops. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, also African-American, distinguished itself during the defense of Bastogne, proving that courage knew no color, though official recognition of their service would take decades. German prisoners, interrogated after the battle, expressed shock at American resilience. They had been told Americans were soft, that they would collapse under serious pressure, that they lacked the will to fight. Instead, they found soldiers who fought with desperate courage, even when surrounded and outnumbered. A captured German officer, questioned at Third Army headquarters, summed up the German miscalculation. "We knew your tanks, your artillery, your aircraft were superior. We thought your soldiers were inferior. We were wrong. Your common soldier fights like our best SS troops, but he thinks for himself, improvises, doesn't wait for orders. Every American soldier believes he can win the war personally. That's what defeated us. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated something crucial about American military culture. American soldiers weren't blindly obedient like Wehrmacht troops or fanatically committed like SS soldiers. They were citizens in uniform who understood why they were fighting. When isolated, when surrounded, when cut off from command, they didn't collapse. They formed ad hoc units, elected temporary leaders, and kept fighting. At Bastogne, when supplies ran low, paratroopers shared their last rations. When ammunition ran short, they made every shot count. When medical supplies were exhausted, medics used improvised materials. The American military's emphasis on individual initiative and small unit leadership paid enormous dividends when normal command structures broke down. The Bulge also revealed American industrial and logistical superiority. Within days of the German attack, hundreds of thousands of replacement troops, thousands of tanks, millions of artillery shells, and endless supplies were flowing toward the Ardennes. American factories were producing more in a month than German factories produced in a year. That industrial might, translated into military power, made German defeat inevitable. By February 1945, American forces were across the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge had delayed Allied victory by 6 weeks, but had virtually guaranteed that victory would be total. Germany's last mobile reserves were destroyed. The Wehrmacht would spend its final months in static defense, unable to maneuver, unable to counterattack, slowly being crushed between advancing Allied armies. At the American cemetery in Luxembourg, over 5,000 white crosses mark the graves of soldiers who died in the Bulge. General Patton is buried among them, having requested to be interred with the men of Third Army he led to relieve Bastogne. The cemetery overlooks the Ardennes, the forest where Hitler's last gamble failed and where American soldiers proved their worth in the coldest, bloodiest battle they ever fought. A plaque at the cemetery contains a quote from a letter written by a sergeant in the 101st Airborne, found on his body after he was killed in the final days of the battle. "We held because someone had to. We fought because no one else could. We won because Americans don't quit. Tell them we did our job. Hitler had bet everything on breaking American will. He believed that soft, pampered American soldiers would crack under the pressure of a winter offensive, that their commanders would panic, that their coalition would fracture. He was wrong on every count. The Battle of the Bulge entered American memory as a story of courage against odds, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things, of democracy's soldiers proving equal to dictatorship's fanatics. The citizen soldiers who held Bastogne, who died in frozen foxholes, who fought until they ran out of ammunition, then kept fighting, had won more than a battle. They had proven that free men fighting for a just cause could defeat any totalitarian army, no matter how well trained or fanatically committed. Hitler's master plan, conceived in delusion and born in desperation, had ended in catastrophe. The Americans he thought would break had instead broken his last army. The war would continue for 4 more months, but Germany's fate was sealed in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where American GIs turned Hitler's final gamble into Germany's final defeat.